Broncos defensive coordinator job is between Sean Desai and Rex Ryan. Why is it Desai way or the highway for the Broncos? You'll get that and much more in today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
The Denver Broncos are in search of their next defensive coordinator under Sean Payton, and the question we have to ask ourselves is, who is the best fit to preserve what the Broncos have already built on the defensive side of the ball? Thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in, making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts in audio format, or whether you watch on YouTube. Do us a favor, hit that subscribe or that follow button down below so you never miss out on a day's worth of Broncos news, content coverage every single day, all year long, because for the true fan, there is never an off season. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host and my partner here on the show, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. The hunt for the next defensive coordinator is on, Sayre, as all reports seem to indicate that an announcement could come this week, but as of the time that we are recording this podcast, there is no official word, but there are a multitude of options that have been thrown out there as possibilities under Sean Payton.
There certainly are, Cody, and I just want to say, without trying to jinx it here, look, we're on a bit of a streak as far as, we record an episode, something doesn't just immediately happen right after, so we'll knock on wood a little bit there for that one. And for those that are watching on YouTube, you can see this. For those listening, you can't see the SD on my hat, Cody. It's not for the San Diego Padres. It's for Sean Desai, right? I mean, no, I'm just joking.
I love it.
As much as I think it would be a great candidate for the Denver Broncos, right? A Vic Fangio disciple, somebody whose name in the coaching ranks has really been on the rise for the last handful of years. And then you kind of get into a tough situation with the Chicago Bears a couple years ago, right? I mean, the Bears were in a state of transition. Obviously, Vic Fangio left after the 2018 season, so they've kind of been stuck in this area of like a rebuilding team and really loading up with those big contracts a few years back. Remember the Khalil Mack deal? Obviously, they signed Robert Quinn. They have so many guys like Eddie Jackson in the defensive backfield. There's Roquan Smith, also a big name player for them previously, but it's been slowly but surely deconstructed. So he kind of got stuck in the middle of a very iffy situation in terms of the talent when he was the defensive coordinator of the Chicago Bears. But does that mean that he's not necessarily the best guy for the Denver Broncos job? I'm not certain of that. We know Sean Desai. He's a very, very smart guy. He worked as an assistant with the Seattle Seahawks this past season. That unit, of course, was kind of feast or famine in terms of maybe they give up a lot of points and yards, but man, they're gonna create turnovers at just the right time. So, kind of a fascinating guy to study in terms of his resume and where he's at and what the confidence level, I guess, of Broncos country would be were he to get hired by Sean Payton and his staff.
Yeah, and I think the counterpart here, right, to set up this entire segment, there's a list of defensive coordinator candidates. We talked about Sean Desai. He's been interviewed. The next guy we're bringing up is Rex Ryan because he's also been interviewed by Payton for the job. But our good friend Mike Kliss said in a recent report that it seems like a guy like Rex Ryan would be a long shot for the job here for the Broncos. And you and I talked about it as well. Going back in history, yes, he's always had some really, really good defenses, but he hasn't coached. He's been out of the game. He hasn't been actively designing game plans to counter some of the NFL's highest scoring offenses and most dynamic offensive schemes that we've been seeing since 2016. He wasn't even doing that. He was the head coach, for the Buffalo Bills before they fired him, and they hired Sean McDermott, who all of a sudden has emerged as a pretty damn good coach for that Buffalo squad there. But between Sean Desai and Rex Ryan, that's why I'm saying, like, for me personally, I don't want to speak for you. I don't want to speak for anybody in Broncos country. But for me, if you had to choose between Rex Ryan and Sean Desai, it's Desai way or the highway for me specifically. And it's all predicated on the fact I think a guy like Sean Desai would keep some of the Broncos assistant coaches like Christian Parker on tap there for Denver. So there's a multitude of things we want to look at. And I also think we look at potential coordinator options. I think the easiest thing that we do is we look at, okay, how did that defense perform? Which I think sometimes if we look at it specifically just from that mindset, it can skew us from seeing, I think, the bigger picture. I think some of the things we have to factor in with Desai in Seattle is they had different personnel. I mean, they had a lot of rookies. I mean, look at Tariq Woolen. I mean, for a guy who was drafted as late as he was, man, he sure did come out of nowhere and impress. Kobe Bryant got some playing time for them in Seattle. I do think that there are some positives you can build upon, especially when you look at the Broncos secondary. I think Desai would preserve that really well.
I think so too, Cody. Another guy that he had in Seattle that comes to mind, Michael Jackson, played a pretty significant role for that defense. Kind of came out of nowhere as well. So I mean that it's one of those things where you look at, okay, you want to find the positives, right? You want to find the positives from what he did in Chicago, the development of Jalen Johnson, obviously their safeties, Eddie Jackson, and that carried over into Seattle, right? With, like you said, Tariq Woolen, Kobe Bryant, Michael Jackson, a number of guys right there. The Michael Jackson development, Cody, quite a thriller, honestly, if you think about it. But I think all jokes aside, all kidding aside, I love the idea of, okay, if you want to go for Rex Ryan, we know he brings those aggressive blitz packages, the pressure packages. You want to pair him up with somebody like a Sean Desai who knows the coverage schemes to play against the passing schemes in today's NFL, right? For lack of a better term, you need like a yin and yang if you're going to bring in somebody like that, somebody like a Sean Desai who's familiar with those passing game concepts, maybe more specifically the Vic Fangio passing game concepts, which I think maybe is what Sean Payton's attracted to in this whole ordeal.
How you and I talked about it yesterday with offensive coordinator, right? Like, we know Sean Payton's going to be the play caller, going to have a big hand in the passing game for the Broncos this upcoming season, and the fact that they should probably hire an OC that will design the run scheme, the run foundation there. I think a similar path could be had here with the Broncos defensively, right? You mentioned it. For a guy like Rex Ryan, he brings the front structure, the knowledge of defensive fronts, while maybe hiring a guy as their passing game coordinator to orchestrate the back end, the passing game. Like, that's what Joe Woods did for the Broncos during that Super Bowl 50 year. He was the DB's coach. He was the passing game coordinator. He had a lot of experience, and that eventually propelled him into the DC job where, unfortunately, it didn't work out with him and Vance Joseph. Now he's got another job as well. He was previously the D coordinator for the Cleveland Browns for quite some time. For me, though, I think that you have to look at that as a possibility. I would not be opposed to the Broncos looking at, okay, we're going to bring in a DC who understands fronts, understands how to, create different pressures and simulate pressures there, even though I think Ajiro ever did a really good job. So I don't think you could throw that entirely out. But somebody, if you're going to go that route, you need to make sure you have somebody who's your passing game coordinator that knows how to manage and deal with some of the passing concepts we see in the NFL here today. That is something to consider. In Broncos country, we are eager for your thoughts. If you had to choose between Sean Desai and Rex Ryan, who would you choose and why? But we're also going to look at some other potential defensive coordinator candidates on today's episode of Lockdown Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends at Built Bar. As you all know it, the best tasting protein bar that is out there on the market today. Built Bars are healthy for you as well, which is crazy to think about considering they're covered in 100% milk chocolate. Each bar contains 17 grams of protein, 130 calories, and only 4 grams of sugar. It's the perfect combination to take right before a workout or a post-workout. You can even enjoy them with a little bit of a crunch if you put them in the freezer for an hour. Or if you're like Sayre, you can put it in the microwave for 10 seconds and enjoy a gooey, delicious dessert that comes in a wide variety of flavors, including peanut butter brownie, churro, and coconut almond. And you can always get your hands on a box of Built Bar now locally if you have a Sam's Club or a Walmart. You can still get them at Built.com, but if you want to go to a local store like Walmart or Sam's Club, you can go there to the pharmacy area of Walmart and you can get a bag or a box of 4 Built Bars today. Or if you want to buy in bulk, go to Sam's Club, buy a 13-box in bulk Built Bar set today that features all the wide variety of flavors that we just mentioned. Make sure you try it out. If you haven't tried Built Bar and you go and you do it now, let us know what you think. You can thank us later. Some other defensive coordinator candidates for the Broncos to consider for Sean Payton. There could be an in-house option, but there's also some other options that do have ties to Payton, some familiarity as well. Thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in and making Lockdown Broncos your first listen of the day. Every single day, you can get this podcast free and available everywhere you get your podcasts in audio format, or you can watch on YouTube with everybody in Broncos Country. Make sure you interact with other members of Broncos Country in the YouTube comment section. Share your thoughts on the episode as well, and it would mean the world to Sayre and I. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, leave us a 5-star review if you love the show. We appreciate you so much. Continuing on here, Sayre, an interesting thing that we found out a little bit earlier this week is that Christian Parker, the Broncos defensive backs coach, did have an interview for the potential defensive coordinator job for the Broncos. And the fact that we haven't heard anything, I think, really suggests, okay, he's in consideration, but I also think they're looking at some other potential pieces as well. You know me. I'm a huge Christian Parker fan. I caught up with Cynthia Freeland of the NFL Network last week at Radio Row, and one of the things she told me, because she asked what outlet we're for, I said Mile High Sports, and she said, you guys need to keep Christian Parker on your staff. You have to find a way. Like she said, I'm pounding the drum for Christian Parker to stay in Denver. And I was like, hey, that's awesome. Like, okay, he's a great teacher. Every player in that locker room loves him. Patrick Surtain had nothing but raving things to say about him. He understands the modern passing concepts that opposing offenses throw at defenses. And when you look at the success that they had with Justin Simmons, Patrick Surtain, the development and rise of Damari Mathis, Ronald Darby playing at a career-high level before a season-ending ACL injury, to me, I think it says, okay, you have a guy here who's very integral for the foundation of the success of this football team.
And it's not necessarily without merit to go with a first-time defensive coordinator, right? I think going into last season, it would have been easy to be very skeptical of Ejiro Evero coming over from the Los Angeles Rams, but he obviously did a very, very good job. And I think a lot of Broncos fans were upset to see him go after just 1 year on the job. So it's kind of that, that double-edged sword where it's like, people want the big name. They want somebody with a lot of experience. They want a, head coach of the defense, which I don't disagree with necessarily, but also, just like we talked about with Ejiro Evero, or just like during the head coaching search, maybe a first-time candidate is the best candidate. We got to consider that possibility, especially with Christian Parker, who, he's popped up in Tom Pelissero's future head coaches articles over the years. He was plucked away from the Green Bay Packers by Vic Fangio. So he's a Fangio disciple. I think a very worthy candidate. I was going to say worthwhile, but he's a very worthy candidate for this position because I think he's, like you said, development of players. That's one of the key things I think that we'll talk about here in a bit. But Christian Parker, obviously a name to look out for. Aside from him, Chris Richard, the former defensive backs coach of the New Orleans Saints, history with Sean Payton. He used to be the Seahawks defensive coordinator. Cody, what are your thoughts on Chris Richard as a potential candidate here? Because I know obviously he may not be that, sexiest candidate, especially when you have somebody like Christian Parker that you could turn to. But does Chris Richard's previous play calling, does that give him an edge over somebody like Christian Parker? I think obviously these two guys are interesting candidates because they both have defensive backfield in their resume.
I mean, it definitely could impact the perception of it, right? And I agree with you. I don't think you can just look for the sexy name as your defensive coordinator hire. You have to look at every option. And, if there's familiarity, that is what's comfortable for a coach. Not saying that Sean Payton needs guys that he's comfortable with around him, but he needs guys around him that he knows can do the job. And I think when you look at it, like how is the perception of Sean Payton? Like, how does Sean Payton feel about Chris Richard? Like, we don't know. We have no idea how he feels about him, but obviously he was on his staff and he was able to be maintained. But we know that Dennis Allen and the Saints did decide to move in a different direction from him this offseason. I'm not quite sure what to equate to that because when I look at the Saints defense last year, particularly in the secondary, man, they were banged up and they traded away C.J. Gardner-Johnson to the Philadelphia Eagles. So they obviously took a step back in some facets. There's former Bronco Bradley Roby that was there, but they just dealt with a multitude of injuries. I'm not quite sure how to make of his departure from the Saints. But, I think with his experience, you always want to be able to learn from it, right? Like if things didn't work out in one area, when you're going through an interview process, it's about being transparent. When you're asked, what went wrong in New Orleans, for example. And that's where you're upfront and you're transparent. Things could have been better. I could have done this better. Here's what I'm hoping to learn from the experience. I'm not quite sure how deep down the rabbit hole this whole thing goes with his departure from the Saints, but he is in consideration here for the Broncos gig and has experience to do the job. So I don't think you can throw that out or hold that against him when we're talking about potential options. Now, there's a veteran name, a guy who used to be a head coach in the NFC North, a guy that George Paton himself is very, very familiar with that is rumored to be in the Colorado area with Deion Sanders and the CU Buffs. His name's been floated out there. Mike Zimmer as a potential option at DC. Mike Kliss, our good friend there, has said there is some noise regarding Zimmer. And, I mean, when I look at it this way, Sayre, could it be in a potential senior defensive assistant role the way that Dom Capers was for the Broncos last year? And on top of that, let's say you do hire another guy. I still think you look at Christian Parker. If he doesn't get the DC job, you keep him on as D-backs coach, but you also keep him on as a passing game coordinator, in my opinion. But what are your thoughts on Mike Zimmer here?
Well, I like the idea of the former head coach in the defensive coordinator's chair. And why is that? Because I think Sean Payton, although he's going to be the head coach of the entire team, I kind of get the impression, and I don't know this for a fact, Cody, and I guess the proof will be in the pudding once the Broncos actually make these hires. But I kind of get the impression that he's leaning towards wanting a former head coach to be able to just be in charge of that defense, to be able to go to sleep at night knowing, okay, somebody like Vic Fangio or Mike Zimmer, they're in charge of the defense. They've done this before. They're experienced. And also, they're not necessarily a threat to leave, right? I mean, let's say you do hire Sean Desai, and let's say you have a top 3 defense in 2022, you don't think teams are going to be calling to try to get him as their head coach as early as 2024, right? So if you hire these guys this season, and they're a threat to potentially leave right after that, then you've got to all of a sudden go through this hiring process again. So somebody like Fangio or Zimmer or even Rex Ryan, those guys don't strike me as threats to potentially leave as a head coach elsewhere, which I think gives you some stability, some longevity. And I think that's maybe where Sean Payton is leaning. So that is where I would really like a guy like Mike Zimmer. Also, because, man, the numbers, you look up the numbers, Cody, from his tenure in Minnesota. I know that a lot of people want to write it off because the Vikings didn't win a Super Bowl and, all these different things. And that's fine if you want to argue that. But in his tenure in Minnesota, just off the top of my head, some of the numbers that I can remember, they were number 1 in the NFL, Cody, in third down defense over his entire time. This isn't just like a one season sample, but when you put all the years together, his entire time in Minnesota, number 1 in the NFL in third down defense, top 5 in points allowed, red zone, all these different things. Mike Zimmer knows how to call a defense. That's why he got hired by the Vikings in the first place. And he did the same thing with Minnesota, despite a bunch of roster turnover. So to me, there's no, like, he doesn't have a bio page on the Colorado Athletics page. I've talked about that before. It's not like he has an official defensive coordinator role for Deion Sanders' team there. I think he would be a very, very good candidate for the Denver Broncos, whether it's an advisory role, like you said, or if he's the DC. I would also like that as well, even if it means the Broncos have to mix up their defensive front, right? Because we know they've been in the 3-4 as their primary scheme. Zimmer doesn't necessarily run that. He runs a 4-man front, but as we know, teams spend a ton of time in nickel anyway. So it's like, how much does that really play a factor personnel-wise when you're transitioning guys? There's a lot to think about there, but I think Mike Zimmer, to me, he may have been the number 1 candidate for me this whole time for the defensive coordinator if it wasn't going to be Vic Fangio.
I think that's a fair point. Just as long as Kellen Mond doesn't switch to the defensive side of the ball and wants to come to Denver, I think, they'll be in good hands there. But, these are some interesting names, and I think these are some of the top names, too, to be considered. And I'm excited to see how it all plays out, and hopefully we'll officially know here soon who the next Broncos defensive coordinator will be. But as we talked about pertaining to offensive coordinators, must-have traits, what must the next Broncos defensive coordinator have in order to be the right man for the job for the Broncos? You'll get that on today's episode of the show. This episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. And the midway point of the NBA season is here, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scorers and threes drained. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay, so don't miss a chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/LockedOn. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. When it comes to the next defensive coordinator for the Denver Broncos, they must have this in order to be the right man for the job. Thank you so much, Broncos country, for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. We appreciate you so much taking time out of your day to listen and engage with all things Denver Broncos news, content, coverage, and more. Here, Locked On Broncos is the place you need to make your daily routine every single day. Sayre, my friend, kind of what we talked about yesterday when we talked about offensive coordinators. What are some must-haves that you should look at when you're looking to hire a guy for a potential role as a coordinator. I think as it pertains to the Denver Broncos, specifically on the defense, I think the thing you and I have talked about the most, the thing that we're skeptical about until it happens is, can the Broncos hire a guy who is going to come in and preserve or build upon what the defense was able to do last year, right? And the saying goes, if it's not broken, don't fix it. But when you look at the Broncos defense, there's still areas that they can get even better in. So maybe Denver might be better off suited with the four-man front, with a standard 4-3 defense in terms of their defensive ends and pass rush. That's something that the Broncos struggled with last year after trading away Bradley Chubb and after Randy Gregory went down with an injury. To me, does the Broncos defense have to remain intact as a 3-4 style of defense here at this point in time? All predicated off of what? The Vic Fangio tree.
That's right, Cody. I think it's a great question. And I think those are all encompassing of kind of where things are at right now in terms of, you think about Sean Payton in this interview process. What is he asking? Like, what is he trying to get the golden answer from any of these defensive coordinator candidates? Like, is he asking him, what's your plan to stop Patrick Mahomes? I doubt it's something like that. But again, it's something to where we've seen the Vic Fangio style of defense that those two high safeties. You obviously know more about that than I do, Cody, but man, they had a lot of success against Mahomes running that type of defense, whether it was Fangio calling it, whether it was Ejiro Evero calling it. They had a lot of success, the Broncos did. And I would say, obviously, even without winning any of those games, the defense played well enough to give us confidence going forward, or even at the beginning of last season, maybe the Broncos could beat the Chiefs. Even if it was a low-scoring game, they might be able to do that because the defense has been able to play well against them, even in the red zone where we know the Chiefs and Andy Reid. Look at the two wide-open plays they had against Philadelphia. I think, obviously, you look at what the Broncos have been able to do against them, especially down there close to the end zone. It's been pretty remarkable. So it stands to reason that Sean Payton is like, we want to keep this Fangio style of defense regardless of who gets hired. But is that the number one priority, or is it more so getting these players in position regardless of personnel? This is where my question, I'll bring this up to you, Cody. You let me know, you let the listeners know, obviously, experience. Does this factor in as a kind of a make or break type of thing? Like somebody like Mike Zimmer versus Christian Parker. Are you trusting a guy like Mike Zimmer to say, okay, whoever we have as personnel, we know that your scheme is going to work because it's been proven, tested over time, over different styles of offense in the NFL. Is experience that number one thing you think for Sean Payton? From his perspective, not necessarily if we could have it our way, because I know we love Christian Parker, but from Sean Payton, do you think he's really prioritizing that in this search?
That's a great question. I think it's fair to ask. To me, for Sean Payton, I don't know if experience has to be the end-all, be-all, right? I think when you look at possibilities, now if you're going to go with a younger defensive coordinator, I think that's where that senior defensive assistant comes in handy. To be honest with you, if I'm any NFL team, I think you have to have a senior defensive assistant anyways. I think it's great to bring on minds like that. And the part that kind of stands out to me is the fact that before Sean Payton was ever hired, before he actually threw his name in the coaching hat, is that he did say he was going to assemble a staff that was going to include a guy like Vic Fangio. So that kind of tells me if he's going to include a guy like Vic Fangio, isn't he looking to add somebody or preserve the dynamic of something that Vic Fangio runs, which is what we're commonly seeing now in the NFL. It's kind of been the counter a little bit to these high-scoring, spread-them-out offenses. And even the Philadelphia Eagles, look, they brought in Vic Fangio this past season to consult defensively for Jonathan Gannon. They brought him in for the Super Bowl for the last 2 weeks to consult the offense to say, okay, hey, Vic, how would you attack our offense? And, they put up 35 points, and they put up more points against the Chiefs than anybody else did this season. So, I don't know. Maybe there is some big Vic energy going on in this. As you mentioned, Ed Donatel. Ed Donatel could potentially even be an option for the Broncos. That's a name I didn't even think of. Has run the Fangio system, knows Christian Parker really well. Or maybe Christian Parker's been in the system long enough, he's confident in his ability to call the defense. But I also think for a guy like CP, you have to really have your other pieces, your assistant coaches, right? We talk about it on the offense side. Who you have as your assistant coaches, they have to be on the same page as you are as the DC, as the guy who's designing the defensive game plan every single week. To me, that's a very interesting question. I think experience is important. Is it the end-all, be-all? I'm not sure it is. I think even in the eyes of Sean Payton, it's not. But I would not be surprised if he decides to go that route. Hopefully at the same time, you can preserve that. But you and I are big on one proponent. Can this next defensive coordinator and the coaches that they bring in or that Sean Payton brings in on the defensive side of the ball, can they maintain the emphasis on player development? That is huge. In my opinion, that is non-negotiable.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing to me, right? You want to see these players improving. You want to see them getting better. Certainly on that side of the ball, you can't be getting worse given the state of things in the AFC West. So player development is massive. And I think, being able to find guys and unearth players, as we talked about with Sean Payton and his offensive staffs with the New Orleans Saints, how they've been able to develop offensive linemen, skill position players, bring in different quarterbacks and help them succeed regardless of their style of play or even ability, the level of play. When you're talking about somebody like Taysom Hill, you look at the defensive side, you need the same type of thing. You need to be able to say, I can have the Cam Jordan types. I can have, the Marshawn Lattimore types, but we're also going to excel with different players who maybe get signed off the street free agent, like Quan Alexander, come in and have success with this team. For the Denver Broncos, obviously, that's going to mean a lot of moving parts. You have superstars like Pat Surtain, Justin Simmons, but can those unheralded guys, like what can you do with Ioma Uwazurike? What can you do with Matt Henningsen? What are you going to do with a guy like Baron Browning, who showed great promise last year? Nick Bonito, the second-round pick. How are you going to elevate his game to make those guys key contributors to the defense? Because I think a lot of times people are going to want the Broncos to go kill these needs with fire and bring in new players, bring in top tier free agents. And they may do that at some spots. But to me, Cody, it's more about player development. It's more about, hey, how can we get a draft class like the Saints had, remember, back in 2017? So I think absolutely player development is the number one thing from my vantage point and hopefully from Sean Payton's vantage point as well.
Broncos country, we are eager for your thoughts on the subject matter. What are you looking for in the next defensive coordinator? What must they have, in your opinion, to help the Broncos either preserve what they've had or build upon that, take it to the next level? Drop it in the YouTube comment section down below. If you're watching on YouTube, tweet us on Twitter. If you're listening on your favorite audio podcasting platform, at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. Broncos country, that'll wrap up today's episode of the show. We're certain we'll find out more news about potential Broncos coaches under Sean Payton throughout this week, with some potential announcements coming sooner rather than later. You'll get that and more on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.